I had never been much of a night owl, but that summer I found myself staying out later than usual. I had just turned 19, fresh out of high school, and with college still a few months away, I had nothing but time on my hands. Most nights I spent hanging out at my buddy Jake's place, playing video games, watching dumb YouTube videos, or just killing time. His parents didn't care if I stayed late, so I usually didn't check the clock until my eyes started burning from staring at the screen too long. That particular night, I left Jake's house around 10:30 p.m. He lived just a few blocks from me, so I always walked home. The streets were mostly quiet, the occasional car passing by, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was the kind of town where everything shut down early, except for the bars and a few fast food places. As I walked, I realized how dry my throat was. I hadn't had anything to drink for hours, and the summer heat still lingered in the air. That's when I noticed the Dollar Tree on the corner up ahead. I had passed by it a million times, but had never actually been inside. It wasn't the nicest looking store, kind of rundown with faded signs, and a few flickering lights near the entrance. But it was the only place around. So I figured I'd stop in and grab a drink. I didn't even think twice as I walked up to the entrance and pulled the door open. And that's when the weirdness started. Something felt off the moment I stepped inside. I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. No background music, no hum of conversation, just complete stillness. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, and about half of them were turned off, casting shadows in random corners of the store. I took a few steps forward, expecting to see an employee stocking shelves, or maybe another customer wandering around. But there was no one. The place wasn't messy exactly, but it had that forgotten feeling, like it had been left unattended for too long. The air inside was stale, and it smelled faintly of something I couldn't quite place, like cardboard and something sour. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were short-staffed. I just needed a drink, and then I'd be on my way. I walked to the back where the refrigerated drinks were. The cooler hummed loudly as I grabbed a bottle of Gatorade, the coldness feeling good in my hand. Turning back toward the front, I made my way to the register. And that's when I realized something strange. The counter was completely empty. No one was there. I stopped in my tracks, confused. I had assumed someone was working, but there wasn't a cashier in sight. I set my drink down on the counter and leaned forward slightly, trying to see if anyone was in the small employee area behind the register. Nothing. There wasn't even a back room visible, just a narrow space behind the counter with a dusty old monitor and a few scattered receipts. That's when the uneasiness started creeping in. I glanced around the store again. No employees, no customers, no sound except for the buzzing of the lights and the distant hum of the cooler behind me. Was I really alone? I took a step back, about to turn and leave, when, "You ready to check out?" The voice came from directly behind me. I jumped and spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the drink. Standing behind the register was a man. Where did he come from? He hadn't been there a second ago. I was sure of it. But now, there he was, staring at me with this weird, expressionless look. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with a pale, almost grayish complexion. His uniform, a green Dollar Tree vest over a plain white shirt, looked wrinkled and dirty, like he had been wearing it for too long. Something about him was wrong. His eyes were a little too wide, and his smile, if you could even call it that, wasn't quite right. It was more like his lips were just barely curled up, like he was forcing himself to mimic an expression he didn't really feel. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Yeah, I muttered, reaching for my wallet. My hands felt weirdly cold even though it was warm inside. The man didn't move as I fumbled for my cash. He just stood there, staring. I placed a $5 bill on the counter. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, just a little too far to the side. Then, slowly, he picked up the money. rang up my drink, and handed me the receipt. I took it without looking at him. Something in my gut told me not to. "Thanks," I mumbled, grabbing my Gatorade and stepping back. The moment I turned away, he was gone. He disappeared. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The register was empty again. I looked around frantically, expecting to see him walking away, but there was no one there. I took a step back toward the counter and peered behind it. Nothing. A chill ran down my spine. I had just seen him. I took a shaky breath, telling myself maybe I had just missed him walking away. Maybe there was a back room I hadn't noticed. I turned toward the door, my only thought now being to get the hell out of there. As I stepped outside, I instinctively glanced back and froze. He was watching me. The man was standing outside now, about 10 feet from the entrance. His expression hadn't changed. His lips were still curled in that wrong smile. His head still slightly tilted. He was just staring at me. I didn't wait. I turned and started walking fast. My apartment was only a few blocks away, and I wasn't about to stick around to see what happened next. As I walked, I fought the urge to look back. My entire body was tense, like I was expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I finally gave in when I reached the next intersection. He was gone. The sidewalk in front of Dollar Tree was empty. No sign of him. But the store was dark. The lights inside were off completely, like the place had been closed for hours. I felt my breath catch in my throat. That wasn't possible. I had just been inside. I had just bought something. I walked home in silence that night, my mind racing, my body on edge. The next morning, I checked online. Dollar Tree closed at 9 p.m. every night. I had been there past 10:30 p.m. And that man, I don't think he was ever supposed to be there at all. I barely slept that night. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing, my mind wouldn't let it go. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that wrong smile. Those two wide eyes. The way he had just appeared and disappeared like he had never been there at all. And the store. How the hell had I walked inside when it was supposed to be closed? I checked my phone at least 10 times, confirming over and over that the time I had left Jake's house made it impossible for the store to have been open when I got there. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next day I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. Sunlight streamed through my window, making last night feel distant, almost like a dream. But it wasn't. I could still feel the chill in my bones, the unease curling in my stomach. I grabbed my phone and stared at the receipt from last night. The timestamp read 10:42 p.m. That sent another wave of cold through me. I had actual proof that I had been inside the store after closing. Something wasn't right. I needed to go back. Later that afternoon, after debating whether or not I was being ridiculous, I finally decided to head back. Not at night, never at night. But while the sun was still up, when the store was actually open. I wanted to see if the place felt different in daylight. The first thing I noticed when I got there was that it looked normal. Cars were parked out front, the doors were open. Customers were going in and out, like any other day. For a second, I almost convinced myself that last night had just been a weird, half-awake hallucination. But when I stepped inside, something still felt off. The air smelled the same, that weird mix of cardboard and something stale. The store was still dimly lit, even though all the lights were technically on. And when I walked up to the register, my stomach dropped, because behind the counter, ringing up a customer, was a completely different cashier. A middle-aged woman, short, with graying brown hair. Not him. I waited in line, my heart pounding. And when it was my turn, I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice casual. "Hey, do you guys have a tall guy working here?" kind of pale, dark hair. The woman blinked at me, confused. Tall guy? Yeah, he was working last night when I came in around 10:30. Her expression changed immediately. The confusion on her face deepened, and for a moment, she just stared at me like I had spoken in another language. Honey, we close at 9 every night. I swallowed. I know, but I was in here past 10, and there was a guy at the register. I bought a drink. I pulled out my phone, about to show her the receipt, but she cut me off. No, you didn't. Her tone was firm now. I froze. What? She shook her head. This store has been closing at 9 o'clock sharp for years. No one's here after that. If you were in here past 10, then... She trailed off, her lips pressing together like she didn't want to finish the sentence. My skin crawled. I turned my phone around and showed her the receipt anyway. She stared at it, and then she went pale. Her hands, which had been resting on the counter, visibly trembled. She inhaled sharply, her eyes darting toward the back of the store, like she expected someone to be watching. I don't know how you got this, she said, her voice lower now, but you need to forget about it. I stared at her. What do you mean? She looked around again, then leaned in slightly. You didn't buy that drink here, and whoever you saw, her voice wavered. It wasn't one of us. A heavy silence settled between us. I swallowed hard, suddenly not wanting to be in the store anymore. I muttered a quick, "Okay," and backed away from the register. But as I turned to leave, she spoke again, a whisper this time. "Don't come back at night." I walked out, my skin crawling. That night, I stayed home. I didn't tell Jake. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat in my room, staring at the receipt, playing the events over and over in my mind. But as the hours ticked by and midnight rolled around, something weird started happening. I kept hearing shuffling sounds outside my apartment, soft, almost deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought it was my neighbors, but then I noticed something strange. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from outside my window. I lived on the second floor. My body went rigid. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing on the sidewalk across the street, just barely illuminated by the glow of a distant street lamp, was the man from Dollar Tree. He was just standing there, not moving, just staring up at my window. My stomach dropped. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, but before I could even unlock it, the power in my apartment went out. Everything went dark. The air felt heavier, like the very atmosphere had thickened. I was not alone in that room. Somewhere in the pitch black, I heard a faint, unnatural whisper. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from inside, right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran. I sprinted out of my bedroom without looking back. The only light in the apartment came from my phone screen, shaking in my grip as I fumbled to call someone, anyone, but the signal was gone. Come on, I muttered, pressing random buttons in panic. My breath was coming out in short, ragged gasps, and my ears were ringing from the pounding of my own heartbeat. Behind me in the darkness, I heard shuffling. Something was moving in my room. No, not moving, sliding, like someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I reached the front door, grabbed the handle, and yanked. Locked. My fingers trembled as I twisted the deadbolt, but the knob refused to turn. It was like someone was holding it from the other side. And then a whisper, right against my ear. "You came inside when you shouldn't have." I screamed. Blind panic took over, and I threw myself at the door, slamming my body into it again and again until, bang! It flew open, and I tumbled into the hallway, gasping. The lights in the building flickered violently. My neighbor's doors remained shut. No one else was awake. No one had heard me screaming. I spun around just in time to see my front door slowly closing on its own. And through the shrinking gap, I caught a final glimpse of the darkness inside. There was a shape standing there. Tall. Motionless. Watching me. The door clicked shut. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I ran. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I rode my bike across town to Jake's house, banged on his door like a maniac, and forced my way inside the second he opened it. "Jesus, dude, what the hell?" he asked, groggy from sleep. I couldn't answer. My hands were still shaking. When I finally calmed down enough to explain, he just stared at me. "That's messed up," he said, slowly. "You sure you weren't just—" "I'm not crazy, Jake. I didn't say that. I just—" He hesitated. "You said the store was closed when you went in, right?" "Yeah. And the guy behind the register. He wasn't real. Jake." My voice cracked. "The lady at the store basically told me he doesn't exist." Jake's face darkened. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. "Okay, let's figure this out." I didn't know what he meant at first, but then I watched as he grabbed his laptop and started typing. After a few minutes, he turned the screen toward me. My stomach dropped. There, on an old local news website, was a story. Dollar Tree employee found dead behind register, murdered during late-night robbery. The suspect was never caught. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. The article was from 5 years ago, and when I scrolled down, looking for a photo of the victim, it was him. The tall, pale man. The man who had rung up my drink. The man who had followed me home. A chill ran down my spine. Jake looked at me. "You walked into that store when you weren't supposed to." I barely heard him. My eyes were glued to the screen. The article ended with a chilling detail. The store had closed permanently after the murder. It had never reopened. So how the hell did I walk inside? I never went near that Dollar Tree again. Jake and I agreed to never talk about it. I moved out of that apartment a month later, into a place on the other side of town. For a while, things were fine. But then, one night, months later, I was driving home from work when I passed by the old store. The building was boarded up now, completely abandoned. But as I stopped at the red light in front of it, my breath caught in my throat. Because standing outside the doors, in the same spot as that first night, was a tall, pale man. He was staring at me. But this time, he was smiling. The light turned green. I floored it. I didn't look back. And I never drove past that store again.